my comments. Just let me finish this one point, and then we'll get on what I know you're really here for. The union movement. I mean, where do we think the concept of the 8-hour day, not that we have much of that anymore, or the 40-hour work week, where do you think Social Security came from? Where do you think any of our social safety net came from that helps us should we, God forbid, lose our jobs? Where did that come from? Where did the middle class come from? There's only really one answer, because we demanded it. I mean, the workers got together, organized a larger movement, and demanded it and made it happen. Nobody, the bosses didn't say, oh, we want better workers, better pay them more. No, the opposite is generally true. After all, that's the way our system rewards them. The less they pay their workers, the more profits they make. It's just the way the system works. And so the only way to counter that is to build a union movement. And I would argue we need a new union movement today. So even if you're not in a union, you should be in the union movement, because that is what's going to save what's left of the middle class in this country. And that's what's going to make sure we live in a more democratic society. Because when you look at all the issues that we're talking about, most of us progressive support, being in union doesn't guarantee that you're progressive, but being in union has meant that the people in unions do vote more progressively compared to those who aren't in unions. And so they really are an important part of our society, and they're under attack. And without collective bargaining, you really can't function as a union. If not everyone has to be in the union, then the union as a whole is weaker. Now you say, well, how about individual choice? Well, let's give individuals a choice within the unions by making them democratic. That's the way to go, not to get rid of the only mechanism that workers have or weaken it to maintain the way of life that I hope we all want to be part of. Anyway, that's my introduction. Let's give a big hand to the person who probably needs little introduction, Sly Sylvester.
December of 2012, the radio station I worked at got blown up, and I lost my job along with my coworkers, and it was a cold December night, and you warmly embraced me and invited me to come down and speak, and it was heartwarming, and it really, I'll never forget that. It was really very gratifying for me. I think it's really interesting, Chuck, talking about progressives not getting the idea of unions. By the way, I have never been technically in a union, but I'm an honorary member of AFSCME Local 1077, the plow drivers here in Rock County. They made me an honorary member, and I'm very proud. I'm very proud of that, because when you look at what they did and the contract that they negotiated, well, it's not a contract anymore, but the agreement that they negotiated, they did really well. And that's because they got 97% of their members to sign up again. And the fact that there are some good people that work for Rock County that were willing to negotiate with them. There is a problem with part of the Democratic Party. I find it hard to believe there are a lot of people that are really progressives that are ambivalent about unions. But I do think there's a problem with people that call themselves Democrats that aren't particularly into unions. And this is something that I really learned during the whole fight over Act 10. The truth is that unfortunately, in 1992, Bill Clinton had a really serious choice to make, and that was whether he would foster the growth of unions, and unions as being a country, and make America a country that continues to make things, or you can take the fast money from Wall Street and pass NAFTA. And I think we know the consequences. And unfortunately, the president had a great speech last night with one sour note when he brought up the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is not only bad for unions, but it's loaded with every other corporate giveaway, terrible on prescription drugs and pharmaceuticals. They're terrible. And look, it's not a coincidence that Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, and if they could get if they could get away with it in Illinois, they'd do it there as well. Look at the presidential map. Republicans have real problems demographically. The upper Midwest has been a solid block to their path to the presidency, they're trying to weaken unions in the upper Midwest, A, because they're cheap bastards that want more money and lower wages, but B, this is a strategy. This didn't happen by accident. And I'll tell you something, Kentucky is not a right-to-work state. And Kentucky has a Democratic Senate. So they can't, and a Democratic governor. So they can't pass their so-called right to work. You know what they're doing? They have spent a fortune in county elections and they're passing right to work laws at the county level. That is how low, now whether this will be legal or enforceable, we'll see. But that is how low they will go. I always say, well, we're dreaming, they're scheming. They're up to no good. And I think one thing that Democratic legislators, they make a lot of mistakes. But the one they don't stress, and Chris Taylor, who hopefully is going to be a governor someday, I think she's terrific. She was on with this Chris Kappinga on Channel 27 over the weekend, and she was going down the litany of things that are wrong with this legislation. But as he was talking about, when I was young, I had to join a union or I had to pay union dues and that wasn't fair, she should have said, this is a guy that's against the minimum wage, voted to strip collective bargaining rights away from 300,000 people, has voted against any sort of legislation that's ever put the government on the side of the worker. Do you really think that right to work is for the worker? It stretches beyond belief that they could somehow try to sell themselves as a friend of workers. Now, I'm not an expert on right to work, but I'll tell you what happens. And this is why it's a tough one to explain. It's tough to explain to people that somebody would have to pay union dues. Well, why should I have to do that? Well, first of all, we're only talking about 7% of the population in the United States because they've so killed off labor unions. But the truth is, and I hate to say it, there are a lot of really short-sighted Americans that work in union shops that don't understand the concept of what they're in. And this is where the union movement has kind of fallen down. And whether it be state employees or whether it be employees in any type of shop, they haven't been building the sort of grassroots effort and the constant education with their employees. They've sort of been on autopilot the last 30 years. Well, the truth is, one of the most beautiful things I've seen since all hell broke loose, and we're coming up on the anniversary of Scott Walker dropping the bomb. By the way, he's with the Koch brothers this week. Right. He's meeting people like Ed Sedlowski Jr., who's now with AFSCME Council 31 in Illinois and was with AFSCME Council 40, organizing nursing homes, organizing and getting people that make $10, $12, $13 an hour to work together to give themselves just a little bit of dignity or just a little bit of workplace safety and maybe just a little raise. Marty Beal always tells me from AFSCME the people that are most dedicated to staying in the unions are some of the lowest paid. And as you know, this right to work is being coupled with outsourcing. They are beginning to throw out custodians and groundskeepers and people that have worked for the state of Wisconsin for 20, 30 years that have the audacity to make $12, $13 an hour. And while chancellors get $50,000 raises and provosts get extra money and there's money donated by rich people to keep wealthy professors in the state, the people that scrub the bathroom floors and showers, clean the dorms, cut the lawn, fix the boilers, they're out. UW Superior, These people were told, you're going to have your jobs back. We're bringing a private contractor in. They offered him $8 an hour. That's what's going on in this state. And how many elected officials that work for the state of Wisconsin on our side are using their bully pulpit to scream bloody murder? How much is the Janesville Gazette, the Wisconsin State Journal, written about, gee, whatever happened, since Act 10, what's life like for state workers or county workers? What's happened to some of these people's lives? Nothing. And so, you have right-wing radio in Milwaukee kind of selling something else. I'll never forget the first day, this right-to-work stuff. Scott Fitzgerald, I call him F. Scott Fitzgerald. He goes on Charlie Sykes' show, and it's like, well, you know what? He goes, there are some of us that have been around here for a while, and we know about all the protests and all the ruckus, but we don't care. That's a really nice attitude. You don't care that people are upset, and they don't. So he says, well, but maybe we could do a carve-out for the operating engineers. Well, the operating engineers are a union that are like this with the road builders and endorsed Walker. They used to be sort of a Democratic union, although they've always sort of played both sides, and they still do a little. And somebody called Charlie Sykes after the esteemed majority leader was on and said, Charlie, this carve-out thing is kind of dangerous. You have workplaces like sheriff's departments where the deputies have collective bargaining rights and some of the dispatchers don't. You have the haves and the have-nots. And do you know what Charlie Sykes said? He goes, when it comes to public employees, we only have the haves and the have-mores. And I thought about the 600 people that work on the University of Wisconsin campus that now have to pay more for their health care and pension, that are living under the Madison poverty line. They live below the poverty line. They're state employees. They go to soup kitchens. They go to food pantries. That's how people are living. So this is all, this right to work is an insidious trick. But I just want you to know it's coupled with so much more. It's like, okay, so we're dodging the bullet for a while on this. There are a lot of horrible things happening to workers right now. And I'm afraid until we get engaged, until the people that we elect start talking as proudly about unions and collective bargaining rights as Republicans do about job creators over and over and over and over again. Until we start talking about that wages are an important part of the economy. And that we want a decent living standard for all employees. Until we start doing that, as you pointed out, we've got a problem with part of our own side. It was really remarkable. It was really remarkable 4 years ago when people came together. Now, I really thought we'd turned a corner. And there are some good residuals out of that. But we have a long way to go. And when I say these things, I get stereotyped. Oh, he's a rabble-rouser. He's a populist. He's far left. He's this or him. They can never talk about the merits of it. They marginalize us. That's why I'm not so crazy about labels. I don't think anything that I'm talking about here on the political spectrum is out of the mainstream. Now think about this. This was a state that public employee unions came up with. Unanimously, collective bargaining for state employees passed a Republican-controlled Senate, signed by a Republican governor. Tommy Thompson made videos touting his great working relationship with state employees and how important collective bargaining is. And by the time he ran for the U.S. Senate, how did that go? He was there in Wauwatosa talking about, we're going to give these state employees, you know, a knuckle sandwich, and they're going to be black and blue by the time we get done with them. He had joined the unfortunate efforts of so many people that just simply don't have a clue of what our employees are like. So how do we get to the point where places like Manitowoc and Sheboygan and Wausau voted for Scott Walker? Was it the bald spot where he hit his head in the cabinet? No. Was it because he's a terrific orator? No. Was it because the state's economy is terrific? No, we're lagging behind. They have somehow taken people that used to be in unions whose jobs were outsourced, or people who lost their small businesses because the jobs were outsourced, and they pitted them against people that had the audacity to make out $35,000 a year and had health care. That's the conundrum we're in. So in some respects, until we start building a better situation for workers in Wisconsin, I don't think we're going to get collective bargaining rights back for public employees. We're going to take that away from them, and it's got to be through a union movement. What other vehicle is there? The other thing you have to do is compare the United States labor laws versus other countries. We are so far behind. We just have, I don't know if it's this rugged individualism. Well, rugged individualism is fine. But if you're working at Quick Trip for $9 an hour, when you used to have a job at GM making $20-some an hour, at least you don't have to be in the union anymore. That's a pretty bad trade-off. What have we got for all this? The stock market that's raging, and every day I hear people talking about income disparity, and it's right under the nose of these commentators. What's responsible for wage disparity? Deindustrialization and the breaking of unions. Look at the efforts they went in Tennessee to stop that plant from unionizing. U.S. Senator Bob Corker essentially using the weight of his office to get in between a union and a manufacturer who didn't mind them being a union, much less a foreign manufacturer. That's incredible. And I think this stuff has become, there's comes a couple troublemakers. This stuff has become so commonplace that we're begun to just kind of like, we just have to decide whether we're going to stand up and start letting this animate us. That's why I get so mad. I get so mad about MSNBC. Rachel Maddow wouldn't talk about labor or the Trans-Pacific Partnership and what's happening in workers' life if her life depended on it. She's a clever, thoughtful talk show host. But the one thing ailing the country, she won't talk about. We need those people. We need those people with the bully pulpit. Well, I have to tell you, this with this Hillary Clinton thing, I'm just like, she's cozied up to Wall Street her whole life. And I don't have a problem with Wall Street, I just don't think they should run America. I don't think that placating them should be a huge cost to the rest of the economy. The other thing is, when a worker's wages get cut, they're not the only person in the community hurt. As I was driving down Milton Avenue here, and I see these check cashing places. I see Penny's closing. But boy, auto title loans, check cashing. Boy, that's a hell of a way to run an economy. Those are so bad, even Glenn Grothman doesn't like them. That's bad. You know, but getting Americans to think about one another, and I know it always gets painted in the picture of, well, this is class warfare. It is. It is. They've been practicing class warfare on American workers for a very long time. And unfortunately, they've been able to divide the American workforce up in a way that they're laughing all the way to the bank. Now, the macroeconomics of Wisconsin clearly aren't that great, especially when you consider our neighbors. But I remember 2010, people were so deflated about everything that getting people out to vote in 2010, and I tried to explain, I said, they're coming. This is going to be really bad, and this is a year they can do the redistricting. I mean, this state, because of apathy and people staying home and not being engaged and involved, and by the way, there's no greater way to get people involved and people out to vote than unions. We replaced Russ Feingold with Ron Johnson. Now there's a guy, the mere mention of his name brings laughter. But you know what he wants to use his new platform for? His Homeland Security and whatever committee. He wants to go after federal employees because he thinks they're overpaid. He wants to examine collective bargaining for federal employees. And they do have collective bargaining. It's a slightly different system. That's what he wants to use with his platform. They are going to take it all. I'm sorry. For progressives you run into, if they get unions out of the way, you know, AFSCME is having to merge their 3 chapters. They kill off the rest of industry. They kill the steel workers. They kill the Teamsters, or diminish them to the point where they hardly have any members left. Do you really think that Planned Parenthood or the Sierra Club is going to be able to stop the Koch brothers? That's what you have to tell progressives. They may not. I think there's this mindset of, well, and some of it is a cultural thing. I see it in Madison all the time. I live on the west side. Oh, that time is past. You know, those blue-collar guys making things, that's dirty. They wear windbreakers. They fart. You know, they're just, you know, that's not my life. We can kind of go beyond that. And believe me, that attitude was pervasive. Now, it's changing for the better. We've got a long way to go. We got a long way to go. And I have to, this right to work thing, I don't know about you, but I'm scared to death that we aren't going to have the kind of crowds or the kind of effort. And then on the other side, I think, well, maybe we shouldn't. Because I've noticed something in the right to work thing. As Charlie Sykes and Mark Belling and Vicky, whatever her name is, all those hosts talk about it, their callers and their listeners were clearly loving going after public employees. There was no problem animating them. This, people are kind of like, It just doesn't seem as, it doesn't seem as fun for them. They're not as animated, they're not as active, and that's why this thing is sputtering. And if I could explain to you what's going on and why it's being delayed, other than Walker's presidential ambitions, I would say this. They've got a real problem because they've done such a divide and conquer job, as Scott Walker said to the widow Hendricks. That's the other thing you need to remind people is, you know, the billionaire whose husband mysteriously died several years ago, she said to Scott Walker, as goes Janesville, you know, how do we make this a red state? How do we make this a right to work state? And he, on cue, By the way, I saw him show more affection for her than he ever has for Jeanette. But he, right on cue, listed it off. Don't think he doesn't want to do right to work. It's the first piece of legislation he ever introduced as a state legislator. We didn't campaign. He didn't campaign on busting public employee unions either. So don't think it's in his heart. He hates unions. But he got a few unions to go along with him because they wanted the road projects. The operating engineers and a couple others, the Milwaukee Police, there's a fine union, and the Milwaukee firefighters don't quite understand the concept of a union. It's like, we want to be able to work in Milwaukee and live someplace else. We'll support Walker. That's really edifying. So anyway, he got a couple of those. And now he's having some problems because I think the future of the Republican Party, if they completely go after blue-collar workers, this right-to-work stuff, I think even they know, especially up in the Fox Valley, that's going to cause him problems. I know right now it seems as though they can get away with anything without any recrimination, but their day is going to come. I can't tell you when. I think we were on the cusp of it. I'm sure election night you were very disheartened. Mary Burke wasn't the perfect messenger. Mary Burke's company was not a particularly great example of a Wisconsin employer because they do manufacture most of their bikes in China. But she's a very fine person. Even with an inexperienced flawed candidate, we were right on the edge of her getting elected. Well, then what happened? For some reason, the National Democrats and the president decided they were going to be Rick Van Winkle and go into some sort of coma. Where was the president we saw last night? In October, in September. You know, that national wave, you know, the statistics that he read last night, they're not perfect and there's still lots of problems, but if you're going to motivate people out, like this isn't going to work. He's learned his lesson, but unfortunately for the midterms in states like